Hi, I'm Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing and to non-discrimination. Thank you so much for inviting me to the global seminar, and I'm so sorry I can't attend in person. But I am very happy to be able to provide you with a few comments by video message. I was asked to say a few words about the right to adequate housing as it applies to this particular and very vulnerable population. I will say at the outset that I intend to write one of my thematic reports on the issue of migrant workers and their right to adequate housing, but I haven't done so yet, which means I haven't done the in-depth research that I intend to do in order to inform my thematic report. I haven't done that research yet at all, and so my comments should be taken as very preliminary in nature, and I look forward to learning more about the issue from many people around the world and doing a thematic report that would be of relevance to the work that you all are engaged in at this global seminar. As your background, the background materials you received for this meeting suggest, the right to adequate housing under international human rights law is not to be interpreted narrowly. In other words, it goes far beyond access to four walls and a roof. And Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is the principal articulation of the right to adequate housing in international law. And the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights at the United Nations, made up of independent experts, has drafted many years ago what they call or refer to as General Comment Number 4 on the right to adequate housing. And in that general comment, they provide an overview of what would constitute adequate housing according to international human rights law. And the definition they come up with is by no means narrow. It includes the concept that everyone has the right to live in a place with peace, security, and in dignity, that everyone should be safe within their own homes, that everyone should be afforded legal security of tenure, that housing must be habitable, that is, protect people from inclement weather, that you should have access to basic services like water and electricity, sanitation services, and if I didn't say it already, that you should be safe within your own home. I think I did say that. With that sort of more fulsome definition of the right to adequate housing, I think that you can easily see how many migrants and particularly domestic workers in irregular situations do not enjoy any of these central tenets of the right to adequate housing. As I said, I haven't done any in-depth research here, but even a cursory review of available literature, or if you talk to anyone who works with migrant workers and domestic workers, you know that they're often living in what can only be described as deplorable living conditions. Most of domestic workers are women, and that contributes to how deplorable their living conditions are and contributes to how vulnerable this population is. And I just want to speak to that vulnerability a little bit before I get into more details about the living conditions and violations of the right to housing. But, the vulnerability of a female domestic worker is really huge. Obviously, there is a power dynamic between her and her employer. And then on top of it, we know that women experience discrimination and inequality. And then as a domestic worker, you experience discrimination based on your class or your type of employment. And then as an irregular migrant, you're also very vulnerable because of your lack of official or formal status within a country. And so the vulnerability of this population is huge and plays itself out very much in the context of housing conditions. Let's take, for example, domestic workers who are living with their employers, and so living in the home of their employer and providing services. We know that women live in terrible circumstances. Sometimes they're living in a closet or, a space with no window, with no door, no lock. When they do have a door in a room of their own, there's often no lock on the door. Sometimes women are forced to live in communal areas, living areas with no privacy whatsoever. And of course, in these sorts of conditions, you can imagine women's vulnerability to sexual violence, harassment, and that sort of physical insecurity. In many cases, the housing conditions themselves are terrible. There's no access to potable water, to electricity, etc. And what makes these conditions so terrible is the vulnerability women experience should they try to ameliorate or change or make better their living conditions, because of the direct connection between their living condition and the power imbalance and the fact that their living conditions are directly related to their ability to gain a livelihood. And so, in other words, you take a woman living in deplorable conditions. If she has the courage to ask for a lock on her door or a room of her own, she risks experiencing some kind of abuse, some kind of harassment, some kind of violence. She risks being rendered homeless, being ejected from the home, and then once on the streets, left to fend for herself, deal with, of course, again, physical insecurity and possible deportation back to her country of origin. So the consequences of trying to improve her living conditions could be quite severe. And so women are left then having to just simply put up with these terrible conditions as they have no recourse, nothing, no way to improve their conditions. And of course, for women who are domestic workers but not living inside their employer's home, they too are suffering poor accommodation that doesn't meet with international human rights standards. We know that most migrants and migrant workers live in deplorable housing conditions. They're often living in informal settlements and in the worst parts of informal settlements. So, without access to infrastructure and basic services, ramshackle homes that are overcrowded and also unsafe for women, no access to sanitation services, garbage collection, etc. Often the water source is unclean and carrying disease. So, and of course, there's, and I should have said this, security of tenure is the cornerstone of the right to adequate housing. And in both cases, the woman is absolutely without secure tenure. She can be evicted from the informal settlement easily. She can be ejected from her place of employment and her home very easily without any legal protections because of her irregular status in both cases. And so I guess for me, what makes these conditions so terrible from a rights perspective is that vulnerability and inability to claim their rights. So we know in international human rights law that rights are only as good as they can be claimed. In other words, rights are illusory if you cannot claim them. And it's not clear how these women can claim their human rights. In the first place, even if they were able to claim their rights, where would they go? In many domestic jurisdictions, there is nowhere to claim economic and social rights. And these women would have no access or very limited access to information about where they could get legal protections to claim their rights. And worse yet, in many domestic situations or jurisdictions, this group of people, their irregular status means that they are not recognized as having rights by law. And that is, of course, completely contradictory and contrary to international human rights law. International human rights law is clear that human rights are never suspended. They do not get suspended based on your immigration status, for example. They do not get suspended if it's a time of conflict. They don't get suspended in the midst of a natural disaster. One's human rights attach to the individual because of that individual's place in the human family. And that is from where human rights derive. It's us as human beings, not rights based on our immigration status. And so whether we are migrants or irregular migrants or domestic workers or migrant domestic workers in an irregular situation, we have the right to adequate housing, and it must be realized, and we must be able to enjoy it. So what is to be done? I do think that the ILO Convention on Migrant Workers is a very solid convention that addresses many of the concerns I raised, and I think that states should be encouraged to ratify that convention. It includes provisions related to human rights. It includes provisions preventing violence, and very importantly, it includes provisions around complaint mechanisms so that this incredibly vulnerable population has access to their human rights. So I'll leave my comments there. I thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to receiving the outcomes from this meeting, which I do hope will inform my thematic report when I turn my mind to that in the next year or so. Thank you very much, and good luck with your deliberations.